CrowdStrike stops breaches. These days, critical work isn't done from the protection of a corporate network. It happens at cafes, back offices, and at home. New ways of working mean new attacks. New attacks require new defenses. CrowdStrike stops breaches so you can do what you do best. CrowdStrike, we stop so you can go. CrowdStrike is offering Security Weekly listeners 15 days free access to its platform. See how it works at securityweekly.com/CrowdStrike. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM. Welcome back, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. Quick announcement, join the Security Weekly mailing list, join our Discord server, and subscribe to all of our shows all in one nice location, securityweekly.com/subscribe. Now, when you join our mailing list, you will get an invite to our Discord server as well automatically. Joining our mailing list and our Discord server really also gets you updates on our webcast and virtual training programs as well. And of course, there's a whole network of shows out there. And we tried to make it easy, so you go to securityweekly.com/subscribe. If you want to chat with us and hang out in Discord, that's cool. If you want to join our mailing list, that's cool. Or subscribe to all of our shows all in one place.
And I updated all the locations of those subscription feeds, so they are all correct now.
Yes, it's awesome. Thank you, Matt. Kwan Lin is a senior data scientist on the Rapid7 Labs team. His day-to-day activities often involve analyzing large-scale honeypot or internet scan data, applying statistical and machine learning methods to address research or operational challenges, and producing data visualizations to communicate findings to broad audiences. You can learn more about Rapid7 at securityweekly.com/Rapid7. Kwan, welcome to the show today.
Hi, glad to be here.
And Kwan, I love your description in your bio, right? Producing data visualizations to communicate findings to broad audiences. And Rapid7, I think, is really unique and really awesome in that you've got a lot of really cool research to pull from, right, in your various projects, including the recent Under the Hoodie report, right, which is reporting on all the pen tests and collecting data that you can analyze. So I guess start, Kwan, by telling us a little bit about the data that you analyze and segue into the Under the Hoodie report.
Yeah, so the report itself, it's based on somewhere over 200 different surveys we've collected over the last year. Currently, the set of survey responses comes mainly from Rapid7 employees. And it's this massive behemoth of a survey that we ask our pen testers to complete at the end of an engagement. It dives pretty deep, gets pretty intricate in the details of like methodologies, time on engagement, weaknesses found, and so on. And that variation across all those responses gives us a lot of insight into what happens at scale. So I think one of the issues with pen testing is the way it's performed. It's oftentimes a very individualized experience. Like, as a pen tester, I might have a dozen or 2 dozen engagements in any given year, but that's a very limited perspective to an individual experience. But when we actually have a broad survey set to work with, suddenly we have this like macroscopic view that can discern trends and patterns, and it becomes a lot more of a holistic view as opposed to a very idiosyncratic view, I would say.
Kwan, when you think about the individualization of a pen test, right? How do you normalize that individuality in a larger data set, right? Because you could have some nuances that certain pen testers do that others don't. Do you have a way to kind of normalize those variations in the data sets?
So, I mean, that is a very tricky point to tackle. One of the things we tried to do first was with the survey, it's not like we have some free-form fields and not free-form fields. So not free-form fields being like radio buttons or selection boxes. So it's like predefined. So that, to a certain extent, that helps us normalize the data and the sets of responses, but that's also very constrictive. So we can put down dozens and dozens of things that we know about in the survey questionnaire. So that helps with the normalization process. But if we have any creative pen testers who are doing things that we haven't thought of, yeah, we would miss that. So I think part of that too is if you look through the actual findings in the report we put out, there's like an other bucket, which is actually quite big. And the fact that it's there isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think it really reflects the uniqueness of the pen testing engagement. Our pen testers will find novel solutions or novel attempts to break into things along the way, which makes it so fascinating. It is a space that, because there's so much variation, we can't really automate this stuff fully. We can try to streamline as much as we can. We can try to normalize as much as we can. But there's no one perfect solution to get everything to fit into these nicely contained buckets. Now, in terms of like tackling the actual data itself, once we actually get this mass of sometimes very messy data, a big part of the job is really just to like normalize it as much as we can. So it might be a lot of like string searching or textual cleanup, especially if it originates from like these open data fields, open text fields, where our pen testers in their responses will like just happily type in whatever they want. So yeah, normalization through some like standardization through the responses, and normalization after the fact through a lot of like data cleanup to just get it to fit into nicer contained buckets.
Kwan, I find
answer.
that it was. Thank you for that. I find that when I analyze these reports, right, because there are other firms that put out similar reports. Verizon has the data breach report that's their customers, right? Others put out data breach reports. Others put out pen testing reports that are summarizing, capturing, analyzing in some way the themes and various data points in the penetration test that they've done. Now, I've covered so many of them over the years that, like, off the top of my head, I could ask questions just about some of the commonalities and even how that relates to the report that you worked on for Rapid7, right? I'd say the number one thing that I pull from these reports to get actionable advice is when pen testers approach vulnerability discovery and exploitation, is it something that can be patched, or is it something that's more in the configuration? And what I found unanimously across the board, the top tactics and techniques aren't preying upon a missing patch. Is that also true in the data that you've analyzed, Kwan?
Yeah. So one of the biggest things we find consistently is, so people are some of our greatest resources within organizations. They're also, unfortunately, some of the most common exploit points. So as an example, one of the things we really dug into was like, how did our pen testers get a hold of usernames and passwords? And that often is the foothold to get in. And a lot of times when we dig deeper on that, it's bad password management. It's a reflection of the fact that like people are doing the bad thing. So yes, there's always that like dimension of misconfiguration that's out there, and there's always that dimension of patches not having been applied appropriately, leaving these exploits open. But then there's always that human dimension of like, well, you can have like the nicest barriers built up, and then you have like your people doing things like, what is it? We're at the tail end of summer. It's like summer 2020 exclamation mark. Suddenly that is like a password that 10% of the population is using. Or I mean, I'm making that particular number up, but like it happens often enough that we're like, there it is again. It's still there, and we said not to do that last year. We said that again the year before that. So a big part of it is the people. People are great. People are also part of the problem.
Yeah, for sure. And I think as people is part of the problem, right, there's still those attack vectors that are there. Like I'm looking at your report, and you're talking about SMB message signing not required, LLMNR, and BIOS poisoning, Kerber roasting, right? I mean, these are attack techniques. They're definitely covered in the MITRE attack framework, right? We've definitely talked about them ad nauseum. You've probably done pen tests for people where you've pointed that out to them, yet it's still out there, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, so I think there's often a disconnect between what should be done and what is feasible to be done. And in the defense of a lot of like security practitioners, there's the list of things to be done is quite overwhelming. With our pen test, we get a lot of responses back about like vulnerabilities, and there are a lot of them. Sometimes the audiences that these are being delivered to are quite small, so the audiences might be like IT or security teams. I'm not in the room when this happens, but I can imagine that when they receive those reports, their eyes probably like glaze over looking at the massive list and how much work that will probably entail, and also like the business considerations that might impede their ability to actually engage in the right corrective actions to fix these like known exploits, known vulnerabilities that our pen testers are actively exploiting. I think the benefit there, though, is it's certainly far more preferable for hired, essentially contractor pen testers to find these things and have it found in the wild by like a legitimate malicious actor.
Yeah, there's definitely some overlap there. And, oftentimes I think it's just realizing that it's not always a patch, that sometimes it's a project and you have to execute on that project, and it's not even as simple as deploying a patch, right? I think if we're trying to glean some of that, actionable intelligence from this report, that's one thing I definitely pulled out. That, and really train your users on for phishing, anti-phishing techniques, right?
Mm-hmm.
So important.
One of the sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, like, I got a text message last night that was like, "Oh, by the way, we found a package, from February, and it was intended for you, and we found it, and click this link to claim it." And I was like, "Oh, wait." I'm like, "No, hold on. Like, this is just common sense." And we can't really teach people common sense, but I think teaching people to just think about messages inside of the context and go, "Well, hold on, wait a minute. If they have my package and they have my name and address, like, why didn't they just send it to me? How did they get my phone number? Like, why?" And they could easily verify a lot of this information. They could tell me who the package was from if they're staring at the package and it's a shipping label, right? They could tell me stuff about it. Why make me like click this link, right? And how would just some random person end up with my package anyway, right? Like, just questioning the intent of the phishing message, I think is something that we can teach in like a super easy way to our users, and would probably thwart many of the phishing attacks, right?
Yeah. And going back to the survey, I think like a lot of the data does come through. So there's a whole bit that talks about like electronic social engineering. We dug deeper on like what methods were being used. So some of the most popular methods, and also very effective methods, because the click-through rates were quite high, was usage of things like just malicious links within emails, for instance. That was pretty common. Redirection to fake websites, that was something else too, especially fake websites that would then try to like collect credentials. So it seems obvious, it seems like common sense, but it is one of those things that's easy to forget about and lapse on. I mean, there's so much going on out there that it does come down to a numbers game, right? When we think about the number of employees out there, the number of people, the number of emails they have to go through every single day, the number of things they actually have their attention distracted from, it is quite easy to maybe have that lapse in a moment where some thought should be given. But it's sometimes like I can see a case where like if you're an employee in a rush trying to get something done, something looks reasonably legitimate, but there's like something slightly off, but you fail to capture in that moment, you might still proceed and do the bad thing that you really shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, for sure.
And that attack is shifting too a little bit, right? I mean, I'm seeing them on the phones now, right? They're coming over as SMS texts, and I tell my wife all the time, I'm like, don't click on that link, just don't do it, because it's a scam of some sort, right? They're trying to phish you, and so the attacks those types of attacks are also expanding beyond email into some of these other devices. And if you're running SMS on your local, MacBook or whatever, now you have, that's potentially a local exploit to get into a network or something like that. So yeah, they're getting crafty.
Yeah, I feel like
for sure.
It used to be just phishing, and then now it's almost like star-ishing, where there's like vishing and all these other variants of like the ishing sort of campaigns. And my background way back when was in economics, and I tend to think that most people tend to be rational economic actors. So if we apply the same lens for attackers, they're engaging in these campaigns for as long as they have, as frequently as they have, because there probably is a payoff. There's like a cost to implementing it, but the rewards are probably sufficiently high. And in this case, we're probably thinking of rewards as like the success rate of actually capturing someone's confidential information, exploiting systems, whatever it might be. So the payoff is there, and it does work. So it'll continue to keep going on as long as people keep falling for these things.
Kwan, what have you found in the data that's changed for good or bad, right, over the years? Because this is not the first time you've done the Under the Hoodie report, right?
Yeah, I think I believe this one is the third iteration of the report for Rapid7. This is my second or third year having had a hand in it. So a lot of things changed, but again, a lot of things still stay the same. So clear text credentials, that remains pretty high up there. Poor password policies, lack of encryption, those are still consistently always up there. They might shift positions in terms of like ranked order in terms of popularity, but they're always consistently like in the top 10 or 20 positions. I think one of the things that really spiked this year was targeted attacks at VPN implementation. So I think one of the things we looked at in detail was aggressive mode for VPN. And I think it does reflect the realities of airtime. So a little bit of something happened a few months back where everyone suddenly went home and started working remotely. And suddenly we're seeing like these massive shifts to working remote, trying to access systems remotely via VPN. So now suddenly VPN becomes this very appealing target. And I think that does show through in some of the data where suddenly VPN-based attacks that were relatively low in the past have suddenly skyrocketed in terms of relative frequency across the pen tests we've surveyed.
And are we seeing more vulnerabilities in that infrastructure? I mean, some of that infrastructure may not have been stressed from a research perspective for a while because you were using other techniques. Are we also seeing a rise in the types of vulnerabilities being found in that VPN infrastructure because it hasn't been tested at scale like we've been doing over the past, few months?
Yeah, so we haven't looked into that particular detail in detail yet. I think that's worth exploring some more. I imagine that a lot of these VPN-related vulnerabilities were probably there consistently. It's just that suddenly now people are paying a bit more attention to it.
Yeah. Back to patch management and configuration, right? They may have been there for a while, but if you didn't patch those systems or you didn't update the configurations, now they're vulnerable to these attacks that maybe weren't high before COVID, but definitely spiked with it.
Yeah, I mean, I do have a lot of friends like in the IT space, and in terms of like infrastructure implementation, suddenly the massive shift from like in-office to at-home work required a lot of like hardware configuration changes, software configuration changes, and the pace at which things had to come together was pretty fast. Like the window was tiny, and I can imagine like in these rush jobs, things were just being missed left and right. So if that's the case, this creates this window of opportunity where like a lot of things that were just flipped on are suddenly like improperly configured because of that rush to get things done.
There's also some interesting web application technologies. Now, Kwan, I assume that these were just found in doing an external assessment and the engagement wasn't specifically targeting a web application, or is it some mixture?
Yeah, I think there's a mix of a number of different things. So we had external engagements, which is really just like an outside-in approach, and then we also had code review engagements, which I guess is really more of an audit engagement process where like just tearing into the code base and trying to figure out like, are there things misconfigured? Are there usages of packages, or open source packages or commercial or otherwise, that are improperly patched or outdated or exposed in some manner? So that was one of the pieces we did dig into in this survey.
And ASP.NET certainly tops the list. Still in the enterprise, right?
Yeah. I get the impression that is something that's not going away. If I recall correctly, that was something else that was cropping up pretty high up on the list in terms of late responses we've seen in the past years. So there definitely is that sort of like trend of consistency. Like these particular technologies will almost certainly always be there, at least for like the foreseeable future.
You also kind of prioritized the vulnerabilities, like what to defend. right? Are there other themes that we haven't talked about yet that we should make defenders aware of, that were popularized in pen tests done by Rapid7?
Yeah, I think one of the things that jumps out quite a bit whenever we do this is the exploitation of like dual use technologies. So that would be things like TSXEC or Windows Management Interface or other things that have like very legitimate purposes to be used on the networks to like administer systems across the environment. But those are also very effective tools, especially for pen testers, especially if they can get a foothold somewhere and elevate their privileges and credentials to a point where they can actually leverage these things to like essentially wreak havoc across our organization. So that is, I would say, probably a very tricky space to be in because like you can't really just take these offline. There is a legitimate use to these things, but at the same time, um, the potential negative impact is also quite high.
Mm. Yeah, I guess I was always groomed like never to leave your tools laying around when I was a Unix sysadmin, and this is a similar kind of thing. Except the tool is going to be there, and you have to make sure that your role-based access controls and permissions and identity management only allows for administrators to do that. But then there's still the risk that someone's going to compromise an administrator account, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think part of that goes then back to like the human dimension again. Towards the end of this report, sort of like honing in on a few base themes that are almost foundational to a lot of these different security concerns. There's the notion of like proper patch management. There's the notion of like proper network segmentation, which those alone might be very effective, right? Because if you have like patch management done effectively, a lot of exploits are just sort of like nullified right off the bat. If you have proper segmentation, suddenly it's not impossible, but at least it puts up a lot of walls and barriers to lateral movement across a network organization. So if, say, you get a single foothold to like a standard user, might be more difficult with those segmentation barriers in place for them to jump to like a domain admin account and then get access to these much more powerful administrative tools that might be limited in terms of access and usage to particular administrators. So there's that component, and then there's also these concepts around like effective authentication with proper usage of like usernames and passwords and like two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication. So there are layers of security that could be laid on to mitigate a lot of these security risks and concerns that our pen testers were able to exploit in many of these engagements.
So under lockout policies and two-factor authentication, it sounds like your team was successful even though those things were in place. Is that true?
Yeah, so it does vary, but what we saw coming out of the data was if there was a lockout policy in place, I guess the way it worked out was probably like some basic research to just figure out like what is the lockout policy, and just sort of like tiptoe around that to make sure you don't trigger the lockout mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's like 5 attempts and you're locked out, it's like, well, we'll push until 4 and then we'll stop there. But then with two-factor authentication, it's one of those things that I make this comment whenever this topic comes up. I feel like this might be reflective of my age, but I'm used to seeing two-factor authentication across like most of the systems I use.
Mm-hmm.
From what I hear from like the older folks in the company, it's like it hasn't always been there, and it's still rolling out. So and that's what we actually see in a lot of the data. It's like a lot of systems that our pen testers manage to exploit do not have two-factor authentication implemented. Which, from my perspective, it's like in terms of like the cost benefit balance, the cost is relatively low compared to the cost is relatively low to the benefit that can be derived because like if you don't have these things in place, suddenly the negative impact of like something bad happening is so much higher. So it seems almost like a no-brainer just get like two-factor authentication implemented. But again, if we go back to the notion of like time limited resources, the human resources being extremely constrained because of all these things going on, it's probably tough to get two-factor authentication fully implemented everywhere. But it seems like in many of these pen test engagements, if that was in place, it would actually make our pen testers' jobs a lot harder. And if it's harder for the pen testers.
That's the tricky part, Kwan, and I hear most pen testers tell me when they talk about two-factor authentication. In fact, I think every single one of them will say the same thing. It's great, but it has to be implemented in every way that someone could possibly log into a system. Otherwise, that's just where the attackers are going to go, right? So you got two-factor authentication on one method of access for this service, but not the other. That's, why bother, right? I guess not why bother, but, you got to protect everything.
Yeah. It's tough. It's I like using the house analogy where it's like if you're trying to defend the house, you got to bolt down all the windows, lock every door, reinforce all the frames. And like as an attacker, you just got to find like one bathroom window that's got like a shoddy little wooden frame that you can just kick in. So.
Right. Yeah, for the two-factor stuff is definitely a great analogy, right? Like you got to make sure that it's on all the entry points into your network. Mm-hmm. Any other themes or recommendations based on this report, Kwan?
Yeah, I think just to reiterate some of the core themes we ended up with, and I feel like these might be the same sets of themes that we reiterate every year. It seems like these are pretty consistent and don't really change that much. It's like patch appropriately, segment appropriately, and just like train up your people and use more effective password management approaches.
Kwan, I like the recommendation of segmentation, even to be more general than network segmentation. What we've been talking about lately is, that network segmentation can be looked at multiple ways, right? You got VLANs, physically separating the network. Then you've got like host-based segmentation. So my users are on the same subnet or whatever, but they can't talk to each other because of Windows Firewall, and that's another segmentation. Then you've got this model of like zero trust, and I also think a component of identity that talks about segmentation of your applications, right? Like this application can't talk to this application in that way, and it's a way to segment your application. So I'm starting to look at segmentation and some of the newer technologies that are available in all those different methods. And it's interesting, we talked about this in the context of PCI, and even Jeff Mann and I kind of came down to like, it's really up to your QSA, what you can show them improve to meet a requirement of segmentation. So, and I think that's going to be the same whether it's compliance or just trying to show that you're doing some level of segmentation, that there's a lot of options that we have today for it. Kwan, you still there?
Yep, still here.
Oh, sorry.
Yep.
Doing it remotely. Sorry. I got too many windows open. Yeah, and I think, it's interesting, I think, for the audience to look at all these reports, and I think certainly you're going to find some common themes, and I think that it should drive some of your defensive strategy to look at how attackers are getting in successfully. Oftentimes the pen test reports are nice because it's in a short period of time, right? Like, I don't know if you have a stat on what your average duration for a pen test. It's got to be around a week or two, right?
Yeah, the vast majority, I think, fell onto like, it tends to fall in week increments. Mm-hmm. So it's like a 10 business day engagements that were set like to 2 weeks or something, and then like 4 weeks and so on. Mm-hmm. So it's like very consistent, like consulting-esque arrangements for these pen test engagements. There is variation. Like we didn't see uniformity in like precisely everyone had 40 hours engaged.
Right.
But there are like pretty broad trends of like, here's a lot of like standardization around this sort of like hours range, and then some standardization around this other higher block. So yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, basing it on how people get in 2 to 4 weeks, versus attackers that may go really low and slow, I think is stuff that you really have to build into your defenses. So awesome report and great work on analyzing all the data. Kwan, it was nice having you on the show.
Pleasure. Have a good day.
You too. Make sure you visit securityweekly.com/Rapid7 to learn more about Rapid7. And you can find the Under the Hoodie report right on Rapid7's website. With that, we'll take a short break, come back with our next interview. Stay tuned.